Marcus Thompson never imagined that a split-second decision on a rainy Tuesday evening would completely transform his life. What started as another ordinary shift guarding the downtown courthouse turned into a moment that would connect two worlds that seemed impossible to bridge. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The courthouse steps were slippery from the October rain, and Marcus Thompson adjusted his security guard uniform one more time before beginning his evening rounds. At 32, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned that life rarely offered second chances, so you better make the most of the first ones. His weathered hands bore the calluses of someone who had worked every job imaginable to keep food on the table for his 8-year-old son, Tyler. Marcus had been working courthouse security for 3 years now, ever since the construction company he'd been with went under during the economic downturn. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady. And steady meant Tyler could stay in the same school, sleep in the same bed, and maybe even believe that the world was a reliable place, despite losing his mother when he was just 4 years old. Every morning, Marcus would drop Tyler off at Riverside Elementary before heading to his shift. Every evening he'd pick him up from the after-school program, help with homework at their small kitchen table, and tuck him in with stories about brave knights and magical adventures. Tyler never complained about their tiny apartment or the fact that dinner sometimes consisted of peanut butter sandwiches. He was too young to understand that his father worked 60-hour weeks just to afford the basics. Too innocent to realize that other kids, dads, didn't fall asleep in chairs because they were too exhausted to make it to bed. The courthouse job suited Marcus in ways he couldn't quite explain. There was something about watching justice unfold, about being part of a system that was supposed to protect people that gave weight to his days. He'd seen attorneys rush past with briefcases full of hope and desperation, witnessed families hugging in relief after favorable verdicts, observed the careful dance of democracy that most people took for granted. Judge Victoria Sterling was one of the few people in the building who ever acknowledged his presence beyond a professional nod. She would arrive each morning at exactly 7:15. Carrying her leather briefcase and wearing the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of making decisions that mattered. What most people didn't know was that Victoria Sterling was one of the wealthiest women in the state, having inherited a fortune from her family's real estate empire before choosing a career in law. Marcus had heard the whispers among the courthouse staff about Judge Sterling's background, about the penthouse apartment overlooking the river, about the charitable foundations she quietly funded. But what struck him most was how she treated everyone with the same measured respect, from the senior attorneys to the janitors who cleaned her chambers. She remembered names, asked about families, and somehow managed to make a 15-story government building feel a little more human. On this particular Tuesday, as the autumn sky darkened earlier than usual, Marcus noticed Judge Sterling working late again. Her office light was still on as he made his final rounds, and he wondered if she ever truly left the weight of her responsibilities behind. He understood something about carrying burdens alone, about the exhaustion that came from being responsible for outcomes that affected other people's lives. The rain had intensified by the time Marcus began his exterior patrol, turning the courthouse plaza into a mirror that reflected the warm lights from inside the building. He pulled his jacket tighter and checked his watch. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Tyler would be asleep by now, watched over by Mrs. Chen from next door, who charged almost nothing because she said Tyler reminded her of her own grandson back in Taiwan. Marcus was thinking about Tyler's upcoming school field trip, calculating whether he could afford the $15 fee, when he heard the sharp crack of breaking glass from the side entrance of the courthouse. His training kicked in immediately, years of military discipline from his time in the National Guard flooding back as he moved toward the sound with practiced caution. What he found would change everything he thought he knew about destiny, about courage, and about the invisible threads that connect strangers across impossible distances. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the empty courthouse plaza like a gunshot in the night. Marcus moved swiftly but silently toward the disturbance, his hand instinctively reaching for the radio clipped to his belt. 20 feet from the side entrance, he could see two figures silhouetted against the dim emergency lighting, one of them holding what appeared to be a crowbar while the other kept watch. As Marcus crept closer, staying in the shadows cast by the tall oak trees lining the walkway, He heard voices carried on the wind. The taller figure was speaking in urgent, hushed tones about getting to the third floor quickly, about files that needed to disappear before tomorrow's hearing. This wasn't a random break-in. Someone had inside knowledge, and they were here for a specific purpose. Marcus felt his heart rate spike as he recognized the implications. If these intruders were after case files, they could destroy evidence, manipulate testimonies, or worse. He thought about all the families he'd seen in these halls, people seeking justice for wrongs done to them, and his resolve hardened. Whatever was happening here, he couldn't let it succeed. He was about to call for backup when he heard a third voice, this one familiar and distinctly feminine. Judge Sterling was still in the building, and from the sound of it, she had encountered the intruders. Marcus could hear her speaking in the same calm, authoritative tone she used in the courtroom, but there was an edge of tension that made his stomach clench with worry. Without hesitation, Marcus abandoned his position of safety and moved directly toward the broken entrance. Through the jagged opening in the glass door, he could see the scene unfolding in the courthouse lobby. Judge Sterling stood near the security desk, her hands raised but her posture defiant. The two intruders had positioned themselves between her and the main exit, and the one with the crowbar was gesturing aggressively while demanding she tell them where specific files were stored. Marcus knew he had seconds to act. These men were clearly desperate, and desperate people made dangerous decisions. He could call for police backup, but response time would be at least 8 minutes, and a lot could happen in 8 minutes. He could try to slip around to another entrance, but that would take time Judge Sterling might not have. Or he could do what every instinct told him was reckless and necessary. He could go in now, using the element of surprise to even the odds. Marcus took a deep breath, said a silent prayer that Tyler would forgive him if things went wrong, and burst through the broken doorway with a shout that echoed through the marble halls. The intruders spun toward him, momentarily startled, and in that instant of confusion, Marcus saw Judge Sterling move with surprising speed toward the panic button behind the security desk. The larger intruder recovered quickly and swung the crowbar in Marcus's direction. But 3 years of military training and the motivation of a father who needed to come home to his son gave Marcus an edge he hadn't known he possessed. He ducked under the swing and drove his shoulder into the man's midsection, sending them both crashing into a display case filled with historical courthouse artifacts. The second intruder lunged toward Judge Sterling, but she had reached the alarm system, and the building erupted in piercing sirens that would bring every police officer in a 5-mile radius running. Still, the immediate danger wasn't over. The man Marcus was wrestling with was stronger than he appeared, and the crowbar had skittered across the floor within reach of the second intruder. Judge Sterling, instead of running for safety as Marcus had hoped, grabbed a heavy bronze statue from a nearby pedestal and positioned herself between the second intruder and the radio equipment that would allow him to call for help. Her face was set in the same expression of determined focus Marcus had seen when she delivered difficult verdicts, and he realized that Victoria Sterling was not a woman who backed down from fights, regardless of the odds. The struggle lasted only minutes, but they felt like hours. Marcus managed to pin the larger intruder just as police sirens began wailing in the distance, and Judge Sterling's improvised weapon proved enough of a deterrent to keep the second man from attempting anything heroic until backup arrived. When the police finally flooded the courthouse, they found 2 would-be burglars in custody and a security guard who was bleeding from a cut on his forehead but still standing protectively near the judge who had refused to be a victim. The aftermath unfolded in a blur of statements, medical checks, and paperwork that kept Marcus at the courthouse until nearly 3 in the morning. Judge Sterling insisted on staying through the entire process, claiming she needed to ensure the integrity of any evidence that might be relevant to the case these men had been trying to compromise. It wasn't until they were finally walking out of the building together, into the early morning air that still smelled of rain and autumn leaves, that the adrenaline began to wear off and the reality of what had happened started to sink in. Judge Sterling stopped on the courthouse steps and turned to face Marcus. Under the streetlights, he could see that her usually perfect appearance was disheveled, her suit jacket torn at the shoulder, her hair escaping from its professional arrangement. But her eyes were bright with something that looked like gratitude mixed with genuine curiosity. "Mr. Thompson," she said, and Marcus was surprised she knew his name. "What you did tonight was extraordinarily brave. and extraordinarily foolish. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I'm sorry, Your Honor. I know I should have waited for backup, but I heard your voice and I thought, you thought correctly," she interrupted, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Those men weren't interested in negotiating. They had inside information about a case I'm hearing tomorrow, and they were willing to do whatever it took to make certain evidence disappear." She paused, studying his face in the dim light. "You have a son, don't you? I've seen you talking to Mrs. Rodriguez in HR about scheduling around school events." Marcus nodded, surprised again by her attention to details. "Tyler. He's 8. And you risked leaving him an orphan to protect someone you barely know." The words hung between them like an accusation, but when Marcus looked at her face, he saw understanding rather than judgment. "I couldn't let them hurt you," he said simply. "It wasn't really a choice." Judge Sterling was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus wondered if he had said something wrong. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back before handing it to him. "I owe you a debt, Mr. Thompson. More than that, I owe you my life. If there's ever anything I can do for you or your son, please don't hesitate to ask." Marcus looked down at the card, seeing her personal phone number written in elegant script. "You don't owe me anything, Your Honor. I was just doing my job." "No," she said firmly. "You were doing much more than that." As they stood there in the pre-dawn quiet, Marcus felt something shift between them. It wasn't romantic or dramatic, but it was real. Here was a woman who commanded courtrooms and moved in circles he could barely imagine, and here he was, a single father working security to make ends meet. By all logic, their paths should never cross in any meaningful way, but sometimes life created unexpected intersections, moments when circumstances stripped away titles and social positions and revealed the essential humanity underneath. Tonight had been one of those moments, and Marcus had the strange feeling that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Judge Sterling seemed to sense it too, because she hesitated before walking toward her car, as if there was something more she wanted to say but couldn't quite find the words for. "Mr. Thompson?" she finally said. "Marcus. Thank you." And then she was gone, leaving Marcus standing alone on the courthouse steps with a business card in his hand and the beginning of a connection that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the world and his place in it. The business card sat on Marcus's kitchen table for 3 days before he worked up the courage to use it. Not because he needed anything from Judge Sterling, but because Tyler had come home from school with a black eye and a story that made Marcus's hands shake with helpless anger. It had started innocently enough. Tyler's class was studying the judicial system, and when Mrs. Patterson asked if anyone had a parent who worked in law enforcement or the courts, Tyler had proudly raised his hand and announced that his dad worked at the courthouse and had saved a judge from bad guys. The other children had been impressed initially, asking Tyler questions about heroes and criminals that made the 8-year-old puff up with pride. But then Jason Mueller, whose father owned 3 car dealerships and whose mother organized charity galas for the country club set, had asked what kind of job Tyler's dad actually had at the courthouse. When Tyler explained that Marcus was a security guard, the dynamic in the classroom shifted like a tide pulling back from shore. "Security guards aren't real heroes," Jason had declared with the casual cruelty children learn from their parents' conversations. "They're just people who couldn't become real police officers. My mom says they hire anyone for those jobs." Tyler had tried to defend his father, explaining how brave Marcus was, how he worked hard to take care of them both, how he read stories every night and helped with homework and never missed a school event. But 8-year-olds were not equipped to argue against prejudice, and Tyler's passionate defense had only made the other children more convinced that the Thompson family was somehow lesser. The black eye had come during recess when Tyler finally snapped and shoved Jason, after the boy suggested that maybe Tyler's mom had left because she was embarrassed by his dad's job. The playground supervisor had broken up the fight quickly, but the damage was done. Tyler came home suspended for 2 days, his face bruised and his spirit crushed in a way that no physical injury could match. Marcus sat at their small kitchen table, watching his son push mac and cheese around his plate, while trying to explain why some people said mean things, why their family was just as good as any other, why Tyler should be proud of who they were regardless of what others thought. But the words felt hollow. and Tyler's silence spoke louder than any argument. That night, after Tyler had fallen asleep, clutching the worn, stuffed elephant that had belonged to his mother, Marcus stared at Judge Sterling's business card and wondered if she had meant what she said about helping. Not help in the way wealthy people usually offered it, with checks and charity that made them feel good about themselves, but genuine assistance with a problem that money alone couldn't solve. The next morning, Marcus called the number on the back of the card. Judge Sterling answered on the second ring, and Marcus was surprised to hear warmth in her voice when he identified himself. "Marcus, I was hoping you would call. How are you feeling? Any lingering effects from the other night?" "I'm fine, Your Honor, but I wonder if I could ask you something." "Not for me, but for my son." There was a pause, and Marcus worried he had overstepped some invisible boundary. Then Judge Sterling's voice came back, softer than before. "What's Tyler's age again?" 8. Marcus was struck once more by her attention to detail, her ability to remember personal information about people most executives would consider insignificant. "Yes, ma'am. He's 8, and he's having some trouble at school. Kids are saying things about my job, about our family, and I don't know how to help him understand that what we have is enough. Would you be willing to bring Tyler to my chambers tomorrow afternoon? I'm between hearings at 4 o'clock, and I think there might be something I could show him that would help." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude that threatened to overwhelm him. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose on your time." "Marcus, you saved my life. Bringing your son to see where his father works, where he proved himself to be a hero, is hardly an imposition." The next afternoon, Marcus walked through the courthouse halls with Tyler at his side, both of them wearing their best clothes and carrying the nervous energy of people entering unfamiliar territory. Tyler had been quiet all day, still processing the shame of his suspension and the confusion of his father's sudden plan to visit the judge. Judge Sterling met them outside her chambers, and Marcus was struck by how different she seemed away from the crisis atmosphere of the break-in. She was still clearly a person of authority, but there was something approachable about her manner as she knelt down to Tyler's eye level and introduced herself. "You must be Tyler. I'm Judge Sterling, and I work with your father. He tells me you're interested in how the courthouse works." Tyler nodded shyly, stealing glances at the impressive surroundings and the portraits of stern-faced judges lining the hallway. Judge Sterling led them into her chambers, a wood-paneled office filled with law books and framed photographs that spoke of a life devoted to public service. "Tyler, do you know what courage means?" Judge Sterling asked, settling into her chair while Marcus and Tyler took seats across from her massive desk. "Being brave?" Tyler offered tentatively. "That's part of it. But real courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing, even when you are scared, even when it's dangerous, even when other people might not understand why you're doing it." She turned her attention to Marcus, and Tyler followed her gaze to his father. "Your dad showed more courage the other night than most people show in their entire lives. 2 men broke into this building, men who wanted to hurt the system of justice that protects everyone in our community. Your father could have waited for backup. He could have stayed safe, but he didn't." Tyler's eyes widened as Judge Sterling continued, describing the events in terms an 8-year-old could understand, but with details that made Marcus sound like the hero Tyler had always believed him to be. "Some people think courage comes from having money or fancy titles or important jobs," Judge Sterling said, her voice taking on the measured cadence Marcus recognized from her courtroom work. "But I've seen wealthy people run from responsibility, and I've seen people with impressive degrees fail to stand up when it mattered. Real courage comes from character, Tyler, and your father has more character than anyone I've met in a very long time." Tyler sat up straighter in his chair, his black eyes still visible but his expression transformed. "Jason Mueller said security guards aren't real heroes." Judge Sterling's expression hardened slightly, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the steel that made her effective in the courtroom. "Jason Mueller is wrong, and if Jason's parents have taught him to judge people by their job titles instead of their actions, then Jason's parents are wrong too." She stood and walked to a wall display that Marcus had noticed, but not examined closely. It contained framed commendations and awards, but Judge Sterling pointed to a smaller photograph tucked between the larger items. "Do you see this picture, Tyler? This is my father. He worked as a janitor in this very courthouse for 30 years. Every night, He cleaned these floors, emptied these trash cans, and made sure this building was ready for the important work that happened here the next day. People like Jason's parents probably looked down on my father the same way they looked down on your dad. Tyler approached the photograph, studying the image of a man in work clothes standing proudly next to a younger version of Judge Sterling in her graduation robes. My father never argued a case or made important legal decisions, but he taught me that every job done with integrity matters, that service comes in many forms, and that the measure of a person isn't their salary or their title, but their willingness to do what's right. She returned to her desk and pulled out a folder, removing several newspaper clippings that Marcus realized with surprise were articles about the courthouse break-in. The headlines praised the quick thinking of a security guard who had prevented a serious breach of the justice system. Jason Mueller's father sells cars, Tyler. That's a perfectly fine job, and I'm sure he does it well. But your father protects people. He keeps our community safe. He stands between good people and those who would hurt them. That makes him a guardian, a protector, a hero, in every sense of the word. Tyler looked from the newspaper articles to his father, and Marcus saw something shift in his son's expression. The shame was still there, but it was being crowded out by something stronger: pride, understanding, and the beginning of a confidence that would serve him well in the years to come. Judge Sterling walked them to the courthouse entrance when their visit ended, and as they reached the steps where Marcus had first really spoken with her, she placed a hand on Tyler's shoulder. "Remember what we talked about today, Tyler, and remember that heroes come in all different forms. Your father is one of them." As they walked home through the evening air, Tyler's hand firmly clasped in his, Marcus felt the weight of the past few days beginning to lift. The business card was still in his wallet, but now it represented something more than a generous gesture from someone he had helped. It was the beginning of a connection that transcended the usual boundaries of class and circumstance, built on mutual respect and shared values that ran deeper than surface differences. Tyler chattered excitedly about Judge Sterling's office, about the newspaper articles, about how he couldn't wait to tell Mrs. Patterson about meeting a real judge who said his dad was a hero. But beneath his son's enthusiasm, Marcus sensed a new understanding taking root, a confidence that would help Tyler navigate future challenges with the knowledge that his family's worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions. What Marcus didn't yet realize was that Judge Sterling had been just as affected by their visit as Tyler had been, and that the afternoon had planted seeds that would grow into something neither of them could have anticipated. The photograph appeared in the society section of the Sunday newspaper 3 weeks after Tyler's visit to Judge Sterling's chambers. Marcus almost missed it entirely, buried as it was among coverage of charity galas and country club events that existed in a world he never thought about. But Tyler spotted it first, pointing excitedly at the image over his bowl of cereal. "Dad, look! It's Judge Sterling!" Marcus leaned over to see what had captured his son's attention and felt his stomach drop. There was Victoria Sterling, elegant in an evening gown, standing beside a distinguished man in a tuxedo at what the caption identified as the annual Children's Hospital benefit. The man was Dr. Richard Blackwood, described as a prominent neurosurgeon and Judge Sterling's longtime companion. The article went on to detail the couple's engagement, announced at the gala to thunderous applause from the city's elite. Dr. Blackwood, the piece noted, came from one of the area's most established medical families and shared Judge Sterling's commitment to philanthropy and public service. The wedding was planned for spring, and the couple would honeymoon in Europe before returning to their new estate in the exclusive Hillcrest neighborhood. Marcus stared at the photograph, trying to process information that somehow felt like a personal betrayal, even though he had no right to feel betrayed. Judge Sterling had never suggested there was anything between them beyond professional gratitude and growing friendship. She had been kind to Tyler, generous with her time, and genuinely warm in their interactions, but Marcus realized he had been reading meanings into gestures that probably contained nothing more than the natural compassion of a decent person. Tyler, oblivious to his father's turmoil, continued chattering about seeing someone he knew in the newspaper, but Marcus barely heard him. Instead, he found himself remembering moments from the past few weeks that now seemed embarrassingly naive in retrospect. The way Judge Sterling had remembered details about Tyler's school situation, her invitation for them to visit her chambers, the personal phone number written on the back of her business card. He had started thinking of these interactions as the beginning of something, though he could never have articulated what that something might be. Now he understood that what felt like special attention to him was probably just Tuesday afternoon to someone who moved through life with the natural grace of privilege and education. Judge Sterling collected people the way other people collected art or wine, finding them interesting for a moment before moving on to more appropriate diversions. The worst part was how much Tyler had come to admire Judge Sterling. In the weeks since their courthouse visit, Tyler had talked constantly about the smart lady judge who said his dad was a hero. He had written about her for a school assignment on community helpers, drawn pictures of courtrooms and gavels, and announced to anyone who would listen that he might want to be a lawyer when he grew up so he could work in the same building as his dad. Marcus knew he needed to find a way to explain to his 8-year-old son that their newfound connection to Judge Sterling's world was temporary, that people like them didn't really belong in the lives of people like her, no matter how kind she had been. But every time he tried to frame those words, they sounded bitter and defeated, and he couldn't bear to crush Tyler's excitement with adult cynicism. The situation became more complicated when Tyler asked if they could send Judge Sterling a congratulations card for her engagement. The innocent request hit Marcus like a physical blow because it highlighted just how different their perspectives were. Tyler saw Judge Sterling as a friend who had been nice to them and deserved celebration for her happy news. Marcus saw her as someone who had unintentionally reminded him of all the ways his life fell short of what he might have wanted for himself and his son. That evening, after Tyler had gone to bed still talking about wedding cards and whether judges wore their black robes to get married, Marcus sat at his kitchen table and tried to make sense of his emotions. He wasn't in love with Victoria Sterling, exactly. Their interactions had been too brief and formal for anything that dramatic. But he had felt something growing between them, a connection that seemed to transcend their obvious differences in status and circumstance. More than that, he had started to believe that Tyler might have opportunities in life beyond what Marcus could provide on his own. Judge Sterling's attention had seemed to open doors, to suggest possibilities that Marcus had never dared to imagine. Watching her interact with Tyler, seeing his son's confidence grow in response to her encouragement, had given Marcus hope that maybe the limitations of their current situation weren't permanent. The engagement announcement forced him to confront the reality that he had been building castles in the air. Judge Sterling's kindness to Tyler hadn't been an adoption audition or a romantic overture. It had been exactly what it appeared to be, the generous impulse of a successful person who wanted to help a child understand his father's worth. The fact that Marcus had read more into it said more about his own desperate longing for something better than it did about any genuine connection between them. The following Monday, Marcus returned to work determined to restore the professional distance that had somehow eroded over the past month. When Judge Sterling arrived for her morning session, he nodded politely, but didn't initiate conversation. When she paused at the security desk, as she sometimes did, to ask about Tyler or comment on courthouse business, Marcus kept his responses brief and formal. If Judge Sterling noticed the change in his demeanor, she didn't comment on it directly. But Marcus caught her glancing in his direction several times throughout the week, and once he was certain, he saw confusion in her expression when he failed to return her customary greeting. By Friday, the awkwardness had become thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus was making his afternoon rounds when Judge Sterling intercepted him in the main hallway, her expression serious and slightly concerned. "Marcus, do you have a moment? I'd like to speak with you privately." Marcus felt his face heat up with embarrassment. The last thing he wanted was a conversation that would force him to acknowledge how foolishly he had misinterpreted her friendliness. "Of course, Your Honor. Is there a security issue I should know about?" Judge Sterling studied his face for a moment, and Marcus had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing far more than he wanted to reveal. "Not exactly. Could you come to my chambers when your shift ends? This won't take long." The invitation felt more like a summons, and Marcus spent the rest of his shift trying to prepare for a conversation he dreaded having. When he knocked on Judge Sterling's door at 6 o'clock, she called for him to enter immediately, as if she had been waiting by the door. Her chambers felt different this time, less welcoming and more formal. Judge Sterling sat behind her desk, still wearing her black robes, and gestured for Marcus to take the same chair he had occupied with Tyler just weeks earlier. "Marcus, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. Have I done something to offend you?" The question caught Marcus off guard. He had expected her to address his changed behavior, but he hadn't anticipated her framing it as something she might have done wrong. "No, Your Honor. You've been nothing but kind to Tyler and me." "Then why do I get the feeling that you can barely stand to be in the same room with me this week?" Marcus stared at his hands, trying to find words that would explain his behavior without revealing the depth of his embarrassment. "I saw the announcement in the newspaper about your engagement." "Congratulations." Judge Sterling was quiet for so long that Marcus finally looked up to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. When she spoke, her voice was softer than it had been at the beginning of their conversation. "I see. And my engagement changes things between us." "How?" "Exactly." The question seemed so obvious that Marcus wondered if she was testing him somehow. "It doesn't change anything, Your Honor. That's the point. I think I may have misunderstood the nature of our friendship, and I wanted to make sure I didn't continue to impose on your time or make you uncomfortable." Judge Sterling leaned back in her chair, and Marcus saw something shift in her expression. "Marcus, what exactly do you think you misunderstood?" Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks again. This was even worse than he had imagined. Not only had he misread her intentions, but now he was being forced to spell out his mistake in humiliating detail. "I thought maybe we were becoming friends. Real friends, not just professional acquaintances. I thought maybe you saw something in Tyler and me that was worth your time beyond the gratitude you felt for what happened during the break-in. But people in your position don't really form friendships with people in mine, and I should have understood that from the beginning." Judge Sterling was quiet again, but this time Marcus forced himself to maintain eye contact. If he was going to humiliate himself, he might as well do it thoroughly. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is that really what you think? That I've been kind to you and Tyler out of some sense of obligation or charity?" Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. Judge Sterling stood and walked to the window overlooking the courthouse plaza, her back to Marcus as she spoke. "Marcus, my engagement to Richard was arranged by our families when we were in college. It's a partnership based on mutual respect and shared social expectations, but it has very little to do with love or personal choice." Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him, but Judge Sterling continued before he could process the implications of what she had said. "You and Tyler represent something I've never had in my life. Genuine connection. Authentic friendship. The kind of relationship where people value each other for who they are, rather than what they can provide. And if you think I'm willing to give that up because some newspaper announced my engagement to a man I've known since childhood, then you understand very little about what the past month has meant to me." She turned back to face him, and Marcus saw tears in her eyes that matched the ones he felt forming in his own. "The question isn't whether people in my position form friendships with people in yours, Marcus. The question is whether I'm brave enough to choose the life I want over the life everyone expects me to live." The morning of Judge Sterling's scheduled wedding dawned gray and drizzling, matching Marcus's mood as he prepared for what he assumed would be his last normal day before everything changed forever. Victoria had called in sick to work for the entire week, and the courthouse felt hollow without her presence. Marcus had heard through the administrative staff that the wedding preparations were in full swing, with hundreds of guests expected at the cathedral and reception to follow at the country club. Tyler had made a card anyway, decorated with crayon drawings of judges, gavels, and wedding bells, insisting that they should still congratulate Judge Sterling even if they couldn't attend the ceremony. The innocent gesture sat on Marcus's kitchen counter, like a reminder of all the ways his son still believed the world was fundamentally fair and good. Marcus was finishing his morning security briefing when commotion erupted in the main lobby. Through the glass doors, he could see a black sedan pulling up to the courthouse steps, and his heart stopped when he recognized the figure emerging from the back seat. Victoria Sterling, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of her judge's robes, walked through the courthouse doors with determined steps that echoed through the marble halls. She found Marcus at the security desk, her eyes bright with something that looked like freedom, mixed with terror. "I need to talk to you," she said without preamble. "Right now." Marcus glanced around the lobby, acutely aware that their conversation would be witnessed by anyone passing through. "Your Honor, shouldn't you be getting ready for your wedding?" Victoria's laugh had a slightly hysterical edge. "That's exactly what I need to talk to you about. Is there somewhere private we can go? They ended up in the small break room behind the security office, a space barely large enough for two people, and certainly never intended for conversations that might change the course of two lives. Victoria paced the narrow space like a caged animal while Marcus stood frozen by the door, trying to process what her presence here might mean. "I called off the wedding," she said finally, the words tumbling out in a rush. "3 hours ago, I called Richard and told him I couldn't go through with it. The guests are probably arriving at the cathedral right now, and I'm here instead because this is where I belong." Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. "Victoria, you can't be serious. Your entire life, your career, your family's expectations." "My family's expectations nearly cost me the only real happiness I've found in years," she interrupted, stopping her pacing to face him directly. "Marcus, that night you saved me from those men. You didn't just protect me from physical harm. You showed me what it looked like when someone acted from genuine courage rather than calculated self-interest." She moved closer, and Marcus could see the vulnerability beneath her usual composure. "I've spent my entire life making choices based on what other people expected, what looked appropriate, what maintained the family reputation. And then I met you and Tyler, and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to be valued for who I am rather than what I represent." Marcus shook his head, overwhelmed by the implications of what she was saying. "Victoria, you're giving up everything for something that might not even work. We're from completely different worlds." "We're from the same world," she said firmly. "The world of people who believe in doing what's right even when it's difficult. The world of people who put family and genuine connection above social status and money. Tyler sees that world more clearly than most adults ever will." She reached into her purse and pulled out Tyler's handmade congratulations card, somehow battered and creased as if it had been handled many times. "I've been carrying this around all week because it reminded me of what matters. Not the opinions of people who measure worth by bank accounts and family names, but the love of people who see past surfaces to what's real underneath." Marcus stared at the familiar crayon artwork, his throat tight with emotion. "What are you asking me, Victoria?" "I'm asking if you think a former judge who just scandalized half the city might make a decent stepmother to an 8-year-old boy. I'm asking if you believe love is strong enough to bridge the gap between courthouse security and federal judiciary. I'm asking if you're brave enough to take a chance on something that everyone will say is impossible." Marcus thought about Tyler's face when he talked about Judge Sterling, about the confidence his son had gained from her encouragement, about the way she had made their small family feel larger and more significant. He thought about the loneliness that had defined his life before that night in the courthouse, and the way Victoria's presence had made him remember what it felt like to hope for something beyond mere survival. "Tyler's going to be so excited he won't sleep for a week," Marcus said finally, and Victoria's smile transformed her entire face. 6 months later, they were married in the same small chapel where Tyler had been baptized, with Mrs. Chen from next door serving as witness, and Tyler proudly carrying the rings. Victoria had taken a position with the public defender's office, earning a fraction of her former salary but finding satisfaction in work that aligned with her values. Marcus had been promoted to head of courthouse security, a position that came with better pay and the respect of colleagues who had witnessed his courage firsthand. Their life wasn't perfect or easy, but it was real in a way that neither of them had experienced before. And when Tyler started kindergarten that fall, introducing his parents to his new teacher with equal pride in both his dad the hero and his mom the lawyer, Marcus knew they had built something worth every risk they had taken to find each other. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.